Okay, hello everyone in the room at KTH and also on Zoom. Welcome to this lecture where we are very glad to have Federico Savini as a guest. We'll be speaking about urban planning and degrowth, what, why, and how. And Federico is an associate professor at the University of Amsterdam. Let me see that I say correct. You're associate professor in environmental planning, institutions, and politics at the Center for Urban Studies. Yes, and you are also one of the co-editors of a quite recent book called Post-Growth Planning, Cities Beyond the Market Economy, that we have been using in this PhD course. And we've taken a lot of interest in. So it will be very interesting to hear your perspective on planning and degrowth. And we are, for those of you on Zoom, we are a group of 16-something in the room here. So the structure will be that Federico will talk about 45 minutes or so, and we'll let Federico talk without any questions. And then after that, we'll firstly give the room for the PhD students to ask questions or comment. And then hopefully we'll have some time also for others to join in. And you can either, if you want to ask or you want to write a question in the chat, but we should have quite good time at the end for questions. So keep that in mind. And then we should close the session at 12:30. Okay, so now and I should say also we're recording this, and the plan is to post it on the website of the Research School Transplace. So if you don't want to be in it, I think, although we will only post a sort of cut, so it's the lecture. I don't think we will include the questions, but in case, I should have thought this through. But anyhow, if you're definitely don't want to appear, no, we'll do like that. I think we can decide that we'll only have the lecture. So I mean, we can stop the recording after that, so you feel it's an open discussion. We will not post that. Okay, so let's start with the lecture. Over to you, Federico.
Thank you, Karin. Thank you very much for inviting me to give this lecture. What I will do in the next 45 minutes, I will basically do many things. So it will be a relatively compact lecture and dense. I will introduce the theme of degrowth. I will try to explain why it's important to use this concept and why it's important to do it today. Then I will also explain how degrowth is useful to criticize mainstream sustainability approaches, which I understand is the theme of your course. And finally, I will give you an idea of how useful the term can be also in urban studies. And hopefully we will have questions to also reflect about the implication of it for urban studies, urban research, but urban practice as well. So when we use the term degrowth, we actually already take a quite strong position about mainstream economic and environmental sustainability approaches. What we do is basically we reject three myths, or we consider three myths of mainstream economic thinking. The first myth that we reject that as degrowers is that economic growth is always good for society and for personal well-being. The second is that economic growth can be actually decoupled from environmental degradation. And the third myth that we reject is that economic growth is necessary actually to achieve climate, and I would argue also social targets. So these are three beliefs that mainstream economists have that often direct and orient policy making in practice. And these are the three myths that Degrowth reject very clearly. Now, why they do so? There are many, many more evidences, of course, of the one that I will give you today, but I would like to pinpoint at a few of them that are particularly crucial. This graph shows you how the relationship between global economic growth, measured obviously as GDP, so as the measure of all production and consumption that takes the form of monetary exchange. So this is how we define economic growth in this case. The relationship of the GDP to CO2 emissions and to the material footprint of the economy. Now, as you can see from this image, at the global scale, there is hardly any decoupling or separation between the increase of economic transactions and the increase of CO2 emissions. But more importantly, you see that with CO2 emissions are in fact growing at a slower pace than GDP. In this case, we talk about relative decoupling in environmental economics. We see that the material footprint, so all the stuff that is mined, that is processed, that is put into cities, objects, real estate, and that is then ejected as waste, is not decreasing in any way. So I tend usually to point particularly at the material footprint, because for urban studies, this is particularly important. The argument here is that mainstream sustainability approaches are not delivering in terms of ecological targets. In fact, if we look at what we should do, we are way, way far from any reasonable scenario of CO2 reduction. This is just one of the many images that the IPCC report publishes every now and then. It shows the targets that politicians in fact have set for themselves, targets that are not ambitious enough according to the climate science in order to avoid the climate and social catastrophic scenario. Well, the image of before shows that we are not at all, in fact, achieving the reduction at the speed and scale that is necessary to avoid a climate breakdown. And when I talk about climate and ecological breakdown, obviously I'm talking about a catastrophic social situation with forced migrations, lack of food, lack of increasing health problems, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not gonna talk long about this, but this is the scenario that we're dealing with when we talk about degrowth. Now, degrowth obviously is a social and ecological critique of the current mainstream economic approach. So when we talk about environmental impact, we always have to consider the unequal responsibilities that different classes in our society have for that impact. Now, the most common idea that is usually mobilized is that we have a very strong difference between global north and global south. It is true that the wealthier social groups of our global economies are located in the global north. It is true that in fact, the highest amount of CO2 equivalent emissions is concentrated. However, that distinction, global north, global south, I think it's insufficient if we look at the contemporary global economy. In fact, it's much more interesting to talk about income groups and class within different regions of the globe. The left image shows you the unequal impact that different income groups have on the environment. Let's take Europe. In Europe, the top 10% income groups emit almost 6 times more than the bottom 50%. If we take North America, this image is obviously much more extreme. But interestingly, also in East Asia, where we might assume that this relationship is not so unequal, we see in fact that the top 10% emits huge amount of CO2 equivalents relative to the bottom 50%. So in fact, when we talk about degrowth, so reduction of consumption and production, we're talking about the degrowth of the richest and the most, in fact, influential classes in contemporary capitalism. The right image is just a trend image, and it shows you, in fact, that the top 1% income of the income group of the globe have increased exponentially their impact on the planet. Now, the reason of this obviously is the privatization of public services, of the commons. This puts a lot of course, responsibility on private corporations. Oxfam produces every year during the meeting of the World Trade Organization, they publish a report about an inequality, and they show, in fact, that, for example, the top 5 multinationals have actually doubled their income in the last 5 years. So we see this disproportional responsibilities of top incomes on the environment. And obviously these people don't eat 1 million more burgers, even though they fly more and they have private jets. But the reason of this disproportionality is related to their investments in commodities and sectors that are environmentally destructive. Now, the other myth that Degrowth rejects is that the economic growth is always good for social and individual well-being. There are many studies today that try to understand whether this is true, and we see nowadays that this is actually not the case. This is one study that particularly looks at city regions, so the urban scale, and it shows, in fact, that up to a certain point of increase of economic wealth, here, the horizontal line, we see that the life satisfaction, which is the vertical line, increases very much. However, we see that at one point, reached a certain amount of GDP, this line goes down, reaching some crucial cases like Brussels and Paris. Cities are very, very wealthy, but somehow perform very badly in terms of life satisfaction. Actually, the cities that in fact tend to perform the best are often in the north of Europe and city regions. And you see the cities that perform worse, often are cities that are very wealthy, like Lombardy, one of the wealthiest regions in Italy, or the city or a region of London. The reason here, obviously, for urban scholars is that these cities are highly unequal cities, where there's a lot of disparity. They are often cities that show segregation, long commuting times, urban sprawl, like the case of Brussels and Paris. So there are many other factors than economic growth that explain the performance of life satisfaction. That's my point here. Now, given these evidences, and there are many more, obviously, but I don't have time to go through them, what does degrowth means, in fact? So degrowth is a program or an agenda, and also a framework that tries to achieve, on the one hand, a planned downscaling of all activities that are environmentally harmful and socially alienating. And this is important, starting from those that are less necessary for the well-being of humans and the environment. Now, this less necessary is very important because, for example, we often mention examples like SUVs or private jets. These are activities that are the evils from the point of view of degrowth. They don't bring collective well-being, they are environmentally polluting, and they also reflect clear class inequalities. The second project of degrowth, however, is a social justice project. In fact, degrowth also claimed to reach a planned increase of all those activities that regenerate the ecosystem and improve social well-being. And here, again, very important, starting from the fulfilling of basic needs. So the basic needs aspect is, again, a key tenet of degrowth. This means basically that degrowth, it's not about reducing consumption and production of essential goods such as health, housing, care for people who need it, obviously. Okay, even though some economists might point out at this thing quite crazily, I would say. Now, why are cities an urban environment? Why is urbanization so important within this story? And this is a bit the field I'm trying to develop at this moment. Now, cities are obviously, by now driving the global economy. We know that. So there are high concentration of capital and as well as materials. In fact, 2% of the global surface is covered into built environment, while that surface concentrates 75% of all materials in the economy. So they are sponges of energy, water, and stuff. However, we also know that some global megacities are particularly relevant for global GDP growth. So in particular cities, this growth critique is particularly pronounced. Obviously, cities like Amsterdam, Stockholm, London, Tokyo, Beijing are there. Also, we know that real estate and infrastructures are, in fact, among the most important sectors for GDP, global GDP growth. About 10% of the global GDP growth is produced within real estate, and also are among the most polluting sectors. In fact, 40% of total resources are used in this sector. And even some calculation claims that 60% of total pollution comes from this sector. Now, eventually, urbanization is a crucial problem for growth and degrowth, because it's not only a process that, as I will explain in a second, creates and depends on class inequalities, so it produces unequal wealth distribution, but also is a process that destroys the environment. So we have a bit of a strong conundrum there. Now, the way urban mainstream sustainability approaches are dealing with this problem is highly insufficient and problematic for three reasons. The first, obviously, is that while the core cities are cleaning up, they are becoming more electrified, they are reducing, in fact, CO2 emission and pollution in some cities, obviously, not all of them, particularly in the global north. This performance, good performance, comes at the cost of sacrificed zones in the urban peripheries of the globe. So the materials for the batteries are extracted in a situation of extreme labor environmental conditions. But also, if you want to look closely at the cities, you don't have to go to Africa to see the drama of this process. You can also simply look at where our waste, the waste of the clean cities like Amsterdam, is dumped and burned, and the consequences that incineration has on the environment around the cities. This is just the way people protest against this process in Rome. The second problem is that the green economy has a huge land footprint. Now, when we talk about land footprint, we're really talking about how much land we use to sustain our green sustainable economy. Lithium, the key material for batteries, is mined through those kind of mines. These are mines in Chile that consume hectares and hectares of land. We know that lithium will be a very scarce material very soon. Even China, which is the major producer of lithium today, will be able to cover only 30% of its own demand of lithium through its own mines. So, in fact, we will have a scarcity of this material. So we will have a peak of these materials. Moreover, we know that if even our cities would be covered in renewable energy, like solar panels, we will not cover more than 2% of their demand of energy. In fact, the problem from a degrowth perspective of renewable energy is that we need to question energy demand and material demands, not simply how we produce that energy and those materials. Obviously, I am a big fan of renewable energy, just to be clear. But nobody would criticize that. But still, we're just digging a hole in the water if we don't consider a reduction in demand. And obviously, starting again from the less necessary productions. The third problem of mainstream sustainability, and this is quite known in urban studies, is that they tend to target areas where there are high rent gaps, where there is possible to have return on green investments. These are areas where real estate is increasing in value, and obviously it's much harder to invest massively in isolation, slow mobility, solar panels in areas that are poorer and marginalized. So these neighborhoods here, just two of the many neighborhoods where urban governments tends to praise the performance of their green investments, pedestrianizing or painting buildings of green, but at the other hand, they are massively gentrifying neighborhoods. The right one is the Isola in Milan. The left one is the pipe in Amsterdam, one of the neighborhoods that has had, in fact, the largest decrease of CO2 emissions in the last 10 years, because they pedestrianized a lot, but it's also one that gentrified the most in the last 10 years. Now, so in sum, what does degrowth mean for urbanization? Degrowth means, in fact, a downscaling and slowing down of the material demand of cities, or rather what I will call the social metabolism of cities. I'm not going to get too much into this concept. We can talk about this later. To do so, degrowth demand and advocates for a project, an agenda that pursue well-being and equality directly and not as a result of economic growth. In fact, this is a critique of trickle-down economics, which have clearly failed so far to deliver in terms of social equality. At the same time, degrowth is the study of processes that increase quality of life by redistributing excess consumption of wealth. I would also include here excess land consumption. We can talk later about the implication for urban policy and urban movements on this, particularly in the housing sector. And fourth, degrowth, in fact, is a project of economic vitality as well, but one that it's an economy that has a low ecological, low land footprints. So, but at the same time achieves high involvement of humans and therefore less involvement of machines. And here there are many implications. Now, all of these implications are discussed by degrowth researchers today. And I'm not going to give you the overview of all the research, but I can give you a brief list of different entry points of the degrowth critique in the study of contemporary economies. And urban studies is one of those, but there are many others. I'm going to go briefly through them. Now, there is obviously a lot of vocal energy within environmental economics. They criticize the use of GDP to drive and regulate national economies, and they rather talk about sufficiency and essential needs. This is mostly research on environmental economics. We have an increasing work on the culture of consumption and also the culture of self-exploitation through work that is essential to break the growth dependency. These works advocate generally and study forms of what they define as alternative hedonism, self-care and pleasure. So basically practices that interrupt the process of exploitation and self-exploitation of labor in capitalism by bringing back the focus on care and pleasure. There is a lot of research on, obviously, different relations of between humans that bypass hierarchies. This is a lot of anarchist work that study autonomy, so all kinds of practices, particularly of commoning, where individuals deal with each other in a way to cooperate, which is their natural way, mostly, in order that in competition with each other. There is clearly a Marxist critique of capitalism and the fetishism of the commodity. Obviously, urban political ecology is very present there. Then, of course, one of the strongest critique of degrowth comes from feminist studies. Obviously, they are very vocal within degrowth research because they focus on all that work of social reproduction that is essential in sustaining the capitalist system, that is often completely invisible to urban policymaking and invisible to society. It's the care work done in domestic environment, and it is being performed, and it is still being performed mostly by women. There is an emerging field of study, of scholarship that's focused on the role of technology, and in particular on property of technology and, property rights of data, open access technologies, convivial technologies. They build a lot on the work of Ivan Illich, and it's also very interesting for mobility studies in urban studies. And finally, there is a work on degrowth from a point of view of north-south domination, or what is being defined as unequal exchange. They obviously start to, they obviously look at indigenous practices of living with nature, trying to have a post-developmental perspective, on breaking the dependency between global north and global south. Well, this is just an overview of all the work that's out there, and obviously my interest is on the study of urbanization. So to address that, in my work, and in my lectures, usually I first try to explain how cities grow, how urbanization works. Now, in order to do this, I need to connect different aspects. And in this graph that I made together with a colleague of mine, we try to combine processes that take place at different dimensions of the urban. The built environment, obviously, the socioeconomic relationship that perform that built environment, and the ecological impact of cities. So the degrowth perspective opens these connections between these three different dimensions of urbanization. Now, I'm going to give you a little, a little guide here. You can follow my cursor. The obsession of economic growth, also within cities, is always economic innovation and economic performance. So we can start here. So when we have economic innovation, so new technologies, new infrastructure, new forms of production and consumption in cities, governments produce de facto an obsolete urban fabric. At one point, basically the spaces we have, the infrastructure we have in a city does not perform properly anymore to accommodate that innovation. Think about, for example, the post-industrial areas in the periphery of cities. In the 80s, 90s, they became spaces for creative innovations. They were retrofitted to an emerging economy, but they were also dismantled as obsolete urban fabric. When you do have obsolete urban fabrics, in fact, what happens next is that more investments come in order to retrofit this, to modify it. Investments always in a capitalist economy involve debt. Debt is essential to understand urbanization today. It's also essential to understand why cities are so dependent on economic growth in order to pay for social services often. Debt demand investments in the urban fabric in order to generate value, often through rent gap mechanisms, so focusing on, for example, gentrifying neighborhoods. This produces displacement. Displacement demands new urban environments, often at the fringe of cities or even densifying within cities. This production of new urban environments produces or creates urban consumption. So basically the demand of new urban infrastructures, the demand of materials, the demand of energy, the demand of water, the demand of land. And this process obviously calls for more efficient ways to accommodate that demand. And here comes back the call for innovation. So you might think about the production of sustainable cities is a call for, circular buildings, or a call for ground heat, or the call for building with wood. And all of a sudden, we have to deal with that in our fabric. Now, this process is connected to environmental impacts of the city. In fact, more consumption always comes with more waste. This is the second law of thermodynamics. We have always pollution, residual heat every time we have consumption and production. This part of waste, of course, is emitted in the environment, like nitrogen, for example, as one of the major emissions of cities. Obviously, some of it can be reused through circular interventions and eventually comes back as a raw material for the production of the built environment. Now, obviously, raw materials always demanded, again, for the second law of thermodynamics. There is no such a thing as perfect recycling or perfect circularity. You always need investments in materials, energy, and heat. This process, connected to the process of urban expansions, obviously increases the footprint of cities. So in this scheme, I try to explain you how this process of economic innovation, displacement, debt, also always generates an expansion of the footprint of cities. something that we might consider as unsustainable. The point here is that governments could obviously turn into a green economy. That's what they do here when they innovate the urban infrastructure by having electrification, so electric cars or electric heating. However, that innovation always is contextualized within this process of growth that eventually also offsets basically those advantages or displays them by increasing the ecological footprint of cities. So eventually we have greener cities, cleaner cities, especially large cities, but we have labor and nature exploitation in in Africa, in South America, and so on and so forth. Now, to accelerate that process, obviously there are some regulations, some state intervention that can accelerate that process. Obviously, if you spatialize your economy, the regional economy, to a particular sector, you tend to attract more investments there. The risk is lower, so this process may be accelerated. Obviously, the privatization of land, of real estate, is crucial to accelerate that process because it opens up to private debt, which is, in fact, a fuel for economic growth because it demands more investment to repay that debt. And another way to accelerate the process, obviously, is to claim that this urban growth machine is green because it also produces some degree of biodiversity in cities. And that's why we see nowadays architects putting trees on buildings. Also, I think another interesting way to accelerate this process, and this is something that happens more and more today, is by having large mega projects. Now, I recently came across this image by a colleague that now happens to work in Amsterdam that shows how more frequent mega projects are. So projects above 400 hectares are within the globe in cities. We see that from the 80s onward, actually, urban and national government actually pushed massively for large-scale urban investments. These urban investments are large-scale debt machines and large-scale, of course, profit machines. They use this as a vehicle to accelerate that process. And often these investments are discursively presented as necessary for environmental sustainability, while actually it is a process that accelerates the environmental impact of urbanization. And by the way, mega projects are also rather known to be a way in which public money are lost and transferred to private investors. So it's one way in which state waste a lot of money that could be used for providing social services where they are needed. Now, in my own work, which is cited here, I should remove this annotate tool. I actually try to elaborate more also on what type of avenues of practice and research degrowth opens. And in a nutshell, I basically summarized the possibilities of urban degrowth with three concepts. The first is autonomy. Autonomy is a central tenet of degrowth research, and it comes from the anarchist tradition of degrowth research. There, in fact, the argument, and I try to summarize very briefly, is that to reach political autonomy of spaces, you also need a degree of material autonomy. So a regional project of sufficiency, so trying to, as much as possible, downscale regional demands and increase the amount of materials that are used and taken out from the region itself, understood as a large-scale region, obviously, is a project of political liberation. Liberation from, in fact, capital and from, in some cases, the global north. Usually for this example, nowadays I use the example of Gaza. Gaza is a typical territory in which an external force has completely fenced out a chunk of a population. By fencing out this population, and avoiding and controlling every single import and export of materials and labor, they keep political control on this population. So the fencing of material flows and labor flows are a technique that enables the submission under a particular power. And that's why material and political autonomy go together. Now, the second term I use is that of finity. Here, I try to rebalance the focus of mainstream economics on scarcity and think in terms of limitation to excess and guarantee of universal basic minimum services. I think that planning should really embrace this term in order to think about what is the minimum level of universal basic services that need to be guaranteed within cities. At the same time, also what is the maximum level of land, space, and materials and property that particular private groups can have. And finally, we need a post-human approach to urbanization that in fact brings back the essential source of life, of human life in cities, which is not cars, is not smartphones, but it is bacteria, bees, insects, birds, rats, mice. This biodiversity in cities is what enables us as humans to survive. In fact, provocatively, sometimes I tell my students that cities are dead zones. In fact, if tomorrow we will have a closing off of every single import and export, cities would be definitely dead zones. There would be a place where we could not or hardly survive because we would not be able to produce food, we would not be able to produce energy. Maybe in situations of war, energy would be produced through burning of stuff of cities, obviously, but that's not... well, anyway, you got my point. The point is bringing back the biodiversity aspect as central and equally important to the human mental health aspects. Now, to conclude, my most recent work, and I'm writing a paper about this, it's also about which type of planning approaches we can mobilize in order to reach this vision, or in order to also start interrupting the cycle of growth that I just described. Now, in my work, I also built a lot on the work of this scholar, Miriam Messner from the University of Maastricht. She is a cultural sociologist, and she studies culture, and she studies ideology, okay? As many degrowth scholars today have rightly pointed out, the problem is not simply a policy problem, it's an ideological problem. It's basically shifting from an hegemony of growth, so an ideology that justifies economic growth and innovation as completely natural to humans, to a radical ideology of degrowth, one that in fact puts at the center care and pleasure and not work and innovation. So this is an ideological process, and as every ideological process also reflect culture, public culture. And I think cities and planning can become the space to nurture that culture. And to do that, we need to consider three processes. I think first is what we call prefiguration. Basically, we need to experiment with the future to act as if we are already in a degrowth society within cities. Prefiguration is essential, and there are many examples of prefiguration in cities, taking, squats, housing cooperatives, urban gardens, sharing practices, shared mobilities, even, voluntary simplicity to a certain degree, but also protest against, obviously, squatting as a form of appropriation of vacant property is also a practice of prefiguration. So this is very important. However, it's not enough. What we need, in fact, is also to popularize this idea of degrowth, to make it popular at the larger scale. And this is at the moment the largest challenge of degrowth, is that it's hardly considered popular. And I must say, even within the left, the neo-Marxist left, often the idea of degrowth is considered unpopular. And I can explain why in discussion if you want. Now, popularization happens through communication, happens through spaces of communication and interaction that are also cities where there is a high density of communication and interaction. So, And the third one, and this is very important, is that of pressure. So the two processes I just described of prefiguration and popularization have no meaning or no impact if they're not combined with practices of pressuring and taking and changing the power of the state. Now, this is a controversial discussion also within Degrowth, especially between the anarchist and the eco-socialist fractions of Degrowth. There's a lot of discussion there, but in my view, the aspect of pressure, so basically the role that social movements have in advocating for a limit to excess, is a very, very, very important. Now, I didn't give many examples. I thought I didn't have time, but it seems I do have time. I'm checking my clock. No, I didn't calculate, so I hope I was within the 45 minutes. Maybe we can talk about examples during the discussion. If you want to know more about this, I recently opened this website. It's a website where I collect all kind of materials, but also where all kind of colleagues working on degrowth and urbanization are showcased. So you can find their emails there. It's a way for giving visibility to this emergent field of research. And I would be very happy if you would contact me if you have more doubts or curiosities about this theme. Thank you very much for listening.
Hey, thank you very much. You just got applause from the room. Maybe you didn't. I didn't have the microphone on. Very interesting. Maybe I can just kick off with a first question. Oh, I should also stop the recording. Sorry. How do I do that? Stopp. Pausa gör jag.